Hey everyone. Today I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the origins of slavery in America. So, this is a big part of chapter 4. So, I want to go over some of the key points. I'm going to go outside of chapter 4 just to give you a bigger and broader picture of slavery as an institution in America, because this really is a defining aspect of early American history, and it will shape a lot of the social, cultural, and political issues and economic issues that will come even after slavery is gone. So I want to have a good understanding of the context of this institution in America and how it became an institution in America. I apologize for my microphone. I'm working on getting a new one, but just bear with me, please. Okay, so the beginnings. So historians tend to trace the beginnings of slavery in the American colonies, in the English colonies in America, to 1619, where privateer ship had stolen slaves from a Brazilian slave trader and brought 20 African slaves to Jamestown. Now, there was no real precedent for an institution of slavery in Jamestown at that time. Most of them were treated, those who were purchased were treated more like indentured servants, right? There was this thought that maybe someday they could be free, they could earn their freedom, they could pay for their freedom, whatever it was. But by 1641, so 22 years later, slaves are legally defined by the colonial governments as the property of their owners. And this is very different than indentured servitude. Indentured servitude, the servants still had rights, and eventually they would be freed. Now you're legally, by colonial law, considered to be the property of your owner. Chattel property, we call it. So you might come across that term, chattel slavery. Chattel just is the type of property that you can own and move, as opposed to real estate, which is the kind of property that you can own, but you can't move. All right. So one of the reasons that slavery begins to grow as an institution in the colonies is because the slaves are considered a more stable workforce than white indentured servants. And I want you to think about why. Hopefully you've watched the Bacon's Rebellion video at this point, which hasn't happened by the mid-1600s, but we're getting close. And we can see, or hopefully you remember, that the indentured servants are going to ask for a lot. They believe themselves to have rights. And when you can totally deny someone's rights, when you can treat them as if they are property, you can require more of them. And so the owners of the slaves view slavery as a positive because they are given just great latitude in controlling and forcing these slaves to work. It's a far more stable workforce in that regard. It also worked better than enslaving Native Americans. One of the chief complaints that the colonists had about Native Americans as laborers was that they would flee. They didn't have to stick around. They could easily get back to their tribe or blend in with the tribe. And because of the lack of African immigrants in America at this time, they're all slaves. They're easily identifiable as a labor source. So these are some of the reasons that the colonial leaders at the time found slaves to be a solution to their labor issue. So the slave trade develops as a result of this growing demand for slavery in the English colonies of North America. And it results in what becomes known as triangle trade, where you're having these ships are engaged in a very lucrative business where they're taking slaves from Africa to the New World and then transporting raw materials from the New World back to the Old World in Europe, and then taking the gold that they get there to go back to Africa and perhaps buy more slaves and then move around in that kind of triangle pattern. The most horrific part of triangle trade was something called the Middle Passage. So I think the video that I'm about to show does a far better job than I could of describing these horrific conditions. We have detailed reports from the captains of these ships and from some court proceedings that you're going to hear about in this video that have helped us as historians to kind of reconstruct the horrors of the Middle Passage. But this is truly one of the worst things that humans have ever done to other humans. So let's take a look at this video.
From about 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homeland and forcibly shipped across the Atlantic, a journey that almost 2 million of them wouldn't survive. By the turn of the 18th century, European merchants were building vessels capable of transporting hundreds of slaves per journey. These ships had extra portholes for ventilation, weapons mounted on deck in case of rebellion, and additional compartments added below deck to take on more human cargo. Before boarding the ships at African port cities, slaves were stripped of their clothing and remaining possessions and had their heads completely shaved. During boarding, which could take weeks or even months, slaves lived on the deck of the ship in a temporary wooden house constructed by the crew. The crew also installed netting around the deck of the ship, designed to catch slaves who might opt for death over forced servitude. Once moved below deck, slaves would find themselves stuffed into compartments with ceilings as low as 4.5 feet, where they would spend most of their voyage. They were segregated by gender and age. Adult men were kept separately and shackled in pairs. Women usually left unbound in their designated compartment, and children often free to move about the ship. There was no plumbing of any kind. Slaves were forced to relieve themselves where they sat, creating hellish conditions when combined with the heat and lack of ventilation below deck. Disease was rampant. Measles, smallpox, influenza, scurvy, and dysentery, the #1 killer, ravaged slaves and crew members alike. The slaves generally spent about 8 hours a day above deck, but were still separated by gender with a barricado, a reinforced wall that could be used to protect crew members in case of a revolt. Slaves were also subject to forced exercise, sometimes including dance and song for the entertainment of the crew. Disobedient slaves were tortured and beaten, usually whipped with the especially cruel cat-o'-nine-tails, a tool designed to inflict maximum pain. Slaves who refused to eat their typical meal of rice and beans were forced to do so, sometimes with the speculum oris, a medieval tool used to pry open unwilling mouths. Women, while usually left unshackled, were raped and sexually abused by members of the crew, sometimes arriving in the New World carrying the children of their attackers. But it was the women, using their minuscule freedoms, who would often coordinate mutinies against their captors. But these rebellions were rarely successful. The true extent of the horrors of the Middle Passage came to light in a 1783 court trial over the slave ship Zong. The Zong left Africa in 1781 with 442 enslaved on board. After a 2-month journey riddled with navigation errors, 62 slaves and 7 crew members had perished without reaching their destination. Disease was spreading throughout the ship, and fresh water was running dangerously low. Captain Luke Collingwood was afraid of the financial cost of more deaths. Slaves that died of disease were not covered by the ship's insurance, but slaves who drowned were. Some 133 slaves were thrown overboard. Collingwood claimed it was necessary to do so to halt the spread of disease. At the trial between the Zong's owners and their insurance company, the owners argued that because it was legal to kill sick animals for the health of a ship, it was legal to treat infected slaves the same. The court agreed, but the trial itself exposed the horrors aboard the Zong. The story was republished by British abolitionists with the name of the ship redacted, meant to show that this tragedy could happen on any slave ship across the Middle Passage. 24 years after the Zong trial, the slave trade was outlawed in both Great Britain and the United States. It would take England another 26 years, and the US another 58, plus a civil war, before the practice of slavery was banned outright.
Yeah, a pretty horrific experience, to say the least. But as we start to see these massive numbers of slaves coming to the New World, and they had been coming to the New World for a lot of years, but really now coming to North America for the first time in the 1600s, we start to see that there is one particular colonial region that's going to become most dependent on slavery as a labor force, and that's going to be the South. And I want you to think about why the South would become most dependent on a slave labor force. Think about what you've read in previous chapters about what the Southern colonies were founded for, right? These are economic motives that are drawing a lot of those Southerners to the Southern colonies that are developing these large plantations that need a lot of labor in order to be successful, right? So it's not a surprise. And in the Northern colonies, we don't see the type of climate or soil that would allow this type of slavery to take root, although there were slaves in those northern colonies for a short period. The middle colonies, although they are oftentimes producing large amounts of crops, think about William Penn in Pennsylvania and the founding beliefs of those in Pennsylvania. So there's going to be reasons that slavery is going to develop differently in the different regions. And as we know, it's going to take root most dramatically in the South. I want to talk a little bit about a resistance, right? Because there is a sense that, maybe at the time, there was a sense that maybe slaves are happy, maybe slaves, being kind of a subspecies of humans was the thinking at the time, are suited for this. And it was really a justification that slave owners used in the South. But slaves were constantly rebelling. So it wasn't always violent revolt. Violent revolts were relatively rare. They were high risk, low reward for the slaves. They were very rarely successful. Usually, if you were involved in a violent revolt, you would be killed, right? You would not escape. So what was more common as a form of resistance was pretending to be sick, breaking tools, working slowly, trying to show the Southern society and the Southern planter aristocracy that the slave labor force was not the most effective or efficient labor force. Running away was more common than violent revolts, but still less common because the stakes were so high. Two famous rebellions that had an impact in the colonial period and one in the antebellum period prior to the Civil War. First was Stono Rebellion, where 65 people are going to be killed, and we're going to see a response, and this is going to be pretty typical of the colonies at the time. In 1739, a majority of South Carolina's population was Black slaves, right? Think about that. A majority of the people living in South Carolina in the mid-1700s were Black slaves. This is terrifying to the white population when they start to see violent revolts. So the Stono Rebellion leads to a moratorium on the slave trade, meaning they don't want new slaves. They don't want slaves who had experienced freedom and maybe had an education, could read and write. They wanted slaves that were born in the Americas. And this is going to be a trend right through the mid-1800s as we lead up to the Civil War, that it's those who have experienced freedom that are going to demand it. That's the thinking behind these types of laws. So South Carolina in 1739 as a colony starts to recognize this and pushes for a moratorium on the international slave trade. This leads to an increase in the domestic slave trade. So we start to see slaves just subject to being sold up and down the American states and colonies. Breeding programs, really, really terrible stuff here, but an end to that international slave trade is beginning by 1739. In 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion, we're going to see some kind of similar consequences. So when there are these violent rebellions, the states are going to ratchet in and clamp down and try and make tougher laws on slaves, and actually slave owners as well, prohibiting them sometimes from freeing their slaves. So some really dramatic responses that are going to make life as a slave far more brutal as a response or as a result of some of these violent rebellions. So yeah, treatment of slaves was brutal, and it was legal. Severe physical punishment was legal. Lynchings, whippings, burnings. We'll read about some of these as we get into the 1800s, because ultimately this is the kind of stuff that's really going to start to convince people in the North who are going to start reading about it, that slavery is an institution that needs to go. One of the most terrifying things for slaves was that their families would be split up. Slaves were bred as if they were non-human animals. They were sold, babies taken from mothers. And it was just a horrific institution that was both physically and psychologically severe and brutal. There's going to be dreams of independence. So I want you to think about this, right? Why did the Revolutionary War provide hope for some slaves? Well, the Declaration of Independence is a radical document. The Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. All men are created equal. And so when slaves start to hear that, they start to think, oh, this is going to be the beginning of the ends of slavery, because certainly we can't be enslaved if we're equal. And so the war is going to result in increased support for abolition. But we understand that all men did not yet include the slaves, right? It did not include women. It was very limited to men in terms of how they were going to be treated politically and legally in the United States. So the Revolutionary War is providing some hope for slaves, but it doesn't really pan out for most slaves living in the South. The northern states after the Revolution are going to either immediately or progressively begin ending slavery in their states. The southern states, it's going to take a war, right? The North had less to lose with their slave population, and the South had too much culturally and economically at stake to let slavery go without a fight. An interesting kind of connection to today with the Black Lives Matters movement. This is that language that they're referencing from this colonial and early republic time period where Black Americans, slaves at this time, were clearly not included when we said all men, right? When we said all lives, that did not include slaves and even free Blacks at the time who had none of the political rights of their white counterparts. And so that is why that movement kind of chose that name. And I think it's an interesting connection to this time period. So we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that in class. The impact of the cotton gin. So we're going to see mass production of cotton become easier now that we have a machine that takes the seeds out of cotton. And rather than drive down demand for slaves, this is actually going to increase demand for slaves, because now that it takes fewer slaves to pull the seeds out, you can expand your production, you can expand your land holdings, and you can harvest more cotton, and it's cheaper to do that processing bit because you don't need slaves to do it. So sadly, this technological development does not make slavery less desirable, but it makes it more desirable. All right. So to think that we become divided over slavery in the 1860s with the Civil War is to not really understand colonial American history. We are divided on this issue from day one. Rhode Island is going to take a pretty radical approach to freedom in the early 1600s. The northern states, as I just mentioned, and colonies are gradually going to end slavery over time in the colonial period, late colonial period, and early republic, largely many of them as a response to the revolution and these ideals of the Declaration of Independence that they wanted to live up to. But slavery doesn't end in the South until the 13th Amendment in 1865. So it takes a war. The nation is going to be literally divided into two countries, and that's kind of where we're headed this semester with this issue of slavery being the driving force that is creating this wedge of division that will ultimately be resolved by the Civil War. Okay, so obviously we'll talk a lot more about this and you'll read a lot more about this, but just kind of a brief intro to the history of slavery in the United States.